Alright, so we've got the simulation done in the previous video for the flame effect, and if we play that, you'll see what we have. Now the trick is to get this thing to actually render out and look like fire. So, how in the world do we do that? Well, it's going to be a bit of a challenge because we're going to have a pretty complex shader setup, not your typical, slap a blend onto a sphere and you're ready to go. This is going to work a lot differently, and it's going to take a little bit of time to set up, more time so than the torch effect that we did earlier. Okay, so let's just go ahead and get started. First things first, let's select the point cloud here for the flames, and what we need to do is apply a particle shader material to it. Okay, so let's do that. Let's go over here to material, and you can do that from the render toolbar or the modeling toolbar as well, and go down here and select ice particle volume. Once we select that, particle volume shader is added to the point cloud, and if we go ahead and render that out, and that looks like it's going to take way too long to render, so let me just go ahead and cancel out that render region there. It's not important anyway. Let's select the point cloud and hit 7 on the keyboard to open up a render tree. And this is what we have. We have our material node and a couple of compounds that are plugged into it. This purple one and this green one over here. So the particle renderer is not exactly the node we used before. If we open up the preset manager and we go to the particles category, the node that we used before for the torch effect that we did a few videos back was the particle volume node. In this case, we're using the particle renderer node, and before we used a particle density node. This time we're using the particle shaper node. So what's the difference? Well, the difference is that this setup right here that we have now is a lot easier and faster to set up than the previous way for the torch effect. Of course, the torch effect used a more complex shader setup, but the advantage to it was that it gives you more control than this setup. But we'll work with this setup anyway, just so you learn how to use this setup and the torch effect setup as well. So for the particle renderer, what we need to do is we need to start to plug in some colors and different things like that. But let's open up the particle renderer first and see what changes we can make here. Under particle color, we're going to leave this alone because we're going to be controlling the color using a gradient later. Now for the density, let's go ahead and start to change some of these parameters around. The density limit I'm going to increase to 10 because 1 is too low. Okay. Now the fall off type, we can set it to linear or cubic. Linear looks pretty good, but cubic looks better. It takes a little bit longer to render, not much though, you won't feel it too much. Elliptical shape, I want to add some elliptical shape to it, but not right now. Now the global density is too low at 50, so let's go ahead and increase that to 400, which is I believe the same value we used for the torch effect, if I remember correctly. If we go to particle color again, we want to leave this alone because we're going to control the particle color using a gradient. Under volume color, we want to go ahead and make some changes here. The tint ambient color, let's increase that to 1, and let's take the ambient color here and let's make it pure white. So the values for the RGB are going to be 1, 1, and 1. Down here under enable illumination, I want to make sure that's turned on, and I want to also make sure that use particle color for diffuse illumination is turned on as well. And for the diffuse intensity, let's increase that to 1. There we go. And we'll leave the ambient occlusion off. We want this to be a nice bright fire. Under volume rendering, we can adjust some of these settings here to render out faster. For example, we can put this on the low settings just for now on the marching. That way we can render out test renders faster. We can also change the cell size to something bigger like 1.5, because the larger the cell size, the faster we're going to render, although the quality is going to be hit pretty hard. And we can even turn on enable fast preview for region, so this renders out faster. So now if we go ahead and render this out, we can see that it rendered out really fast. Of course, this doesn't look anything like fire right now. It's just this big yellow mass of stuff, which is obviously no good. So let's cancel out that render region and let's close this PPG. It's time to start changing some of the particle shape over here. So let's open up the PPG for the particle shaper node. We can see we have ourselves just a few tabs, not too many. So it's a more simplified way of adjusting the shape. Okay, so we can see here in our little shader ball preview here, we can start to see the changes that are being done to the particle effect. Let's take the intensity of the irregular shape tab here, which is the only parameter in this tab, and let's lower it to something really low, like 0.05 or 0.04, something like that. Now let's go over here to cell shape, and let's take the cell shape and lower the intensity to something really low. And you can see that when we do that, we get this cell shape that's rounder, and it completely changes the shape of it so it doesn't look like so randomized. It just have this nice little round shape. And let's take the texture scale and let's increase that. And another way of seeing this a little bit better, let's close this shader ball preview. Let's go down here to the particle shaper and click on the little V icon to open up a preview for it. And now we can see the particle shaper here. Let's increase the texture scale to almost twice to what it was before. So about 30 is fine. Let's go to fractal shape. And now what we'll do is we'll take the intensity here of the fractal shape and increase it. Let's get it to about 0.8. Okay, that looks pretty good. We can start to see the change here. And that change is actually going to affect the particle cloud itself. If we go ahead and do a render region on this, now you can see it's a little bit noisier right there. And we won't really see the changes take effect too strongly until we start to add some color and start to adjust some of the lighting here. So we'll take the texture scale and lower it to about 13. It's pretty good. So now we start to get this sort of shape here. Alright. We'll take the contrast here and we'll take the furrow width and let's increase that just a little bit. Something just below 0.1 will work out just fine. The furrow softness, let's go ahead and lower that to about 0.3. So now we get this nice contrasting effect. And we'll take the fractal time constant. Let's see if increasing this is going to do us any good. Well, it did make a little bit of a change. Sort of changed the pattern there for the actual particle shaper. Now, under AO fake or ambient occlusion fake, we're going to leave that alone. Presets, we don't want to use any of these presets because it's going to undo all the changes we made here. So let's close that and let's close that. Now what we need to do is we need to start to adjust the color of this particle effect. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's open up the preset manager and we're going to pull up a particle gradient to pull this off. So let's take the particle gradient, drop it in here, close that. Okay, now the particle gradient, we're going to take this and plug it into the particle renderer compound. And where we want to plug it into is inside the category called per cloud or gradient. And we want to plug it into the global gradient color, not the global gradient density. So we'll plug it in there. Okay, now you see the color update and change here in the shader ball preview. And this is the default color that the gradient has, which is no good. So let's open up the particle gradient and we'll worry about the position a little bit later. Let's go over here to the colors. These are no good here. So to get us started, let's choose the fire preset, which isn't going to look that great anyway. So we can see here in the shader ball preview, it doesn't really look that good. And at this point, you can go ahead and do a render preview here and see what it's looking like. Which you can see here, it's not looking too great. Definitely looks more interesting than before, but doesn't look too fantastic. Let's go to the particle renderer here. Let's open up its PPG and under volume rendering, let's turn off the enable fast preview for region. Okay, and let's close that. This way we get a more accurate look at our particles. See the difference now? Huge difference than before. That's why I don't really like to use the render preview option, because it really totally changes the look of the particles to the point where you can be tweaking this and not realize that that's not the way it's going to look in the final result. So it's looking better, but still doesn't look like fire, and that's because of the particle gradient here, which is controlling the colors of the particle effect. Okay, so the fire preset is a pretty good starting off point, but it's not going to solve all your problems. First of all, this red doesn't look too great. And if we do a render region, and we look at our gradient here, although it's a little bit difficult to comprehend at first glance, you can start to see what is affecting what here. Okay, so here we have all these colors. We have this bright white over here at the end, then it's followed by this sort of sunflower yellow, then we have this kind of brown color, and then we have this bright red. If you look carefully at the render region, let me go ahead and render out this area over here instead, where you can see some bright colors here. You can start to see where the colors are showing up. You can see the bright whites are deep inside the particle effect where it's really concentrated right there. It's barely visible. Then you can see this sort of sunflower yellow start to come out right here. And you can see it all over the particle effect. You can kind of see this brown color trying to come out a little bit right there. It's a little bit light because the effect is pretty strong. And then you see the red all over the outside and the rims of the particle cloud. Okay, so if the red is this area here, let's take the red and let's change it to pure black and see what that gives us. Because we need this fire to have a range from bright hot yellows almost to the point where it's white, almost white, to nice oranges. And then we also need these puffs of black sort of smoke on the edges and surrounding the outside of the fire effect. And you can see when we turn that to black, you can start to see that the effect is more pronounced. And this looks way better than having this red. So the black's looking pretty good. Okay. All right, let's continue to change and affect the particle gradient here. Let's take this brown, for example, and let's go ahead and make it a little bit darker. So let's lower its red value here to about 0.4. And let's take its green value here and also lower that to about 0.2 works pretty good, or just below 0.2 works fine. And the blue, we're going to go ahead and increase this, give this a little bit of a blue value here, very small amount. And right now it just keeps rendering over and over again right here in the render region, which can slow down our workflow. So I'm going to cancel the render region out. Okay, and let's add that little bit of blue close to 0.1 is what I want. So about right there is pretty good. The alpha is going to have no effect, so we'll leave that alone. Okay, now the position, which you can see here, is 0.65. Let me go ahead and increase that to about 0.75. So close to 0.75 is pretty good. Okay, it doesn't have to be totally exact. All right, pretty good. Now this sunflower yellow. Let's take this sunflower yellow color and brighten it up because it's a little bit too dark right now. So let's switch over here from RGB to HSV. Okay, and let's take the hue over here and drop it to about 0.1 will work out pretty good, so it's a little bit more orange, and we want it to be yellow. So you're probably wondering, okay, so why are we going to orange? You'll see in a moment why that is. Let's drop the saturation here to about 0.75. So we'll drop it. That looks pretty good. Again, it doesn't have to be totally exact. Now the value, we want to blow it out, so let's put it to 2 so it gets really bright. Okay, and the position right now is it's located on the gradient position of 0.25. So let's actually move its position to closer to 0.3. So something like that will work out just fine. Now let's do render region, see what we have. Okay, so now we have something that looks a little bit better. We have this nice little fire effect. You can see the hot burning fire deep in the core of the fire of the flame itself, which looks pretty cool. But we still have to do plenty of tweaking to get this to look right. And working with these volume shaders involves a lot of tweaking and a lot of time to get right until you get really used to them. Okay, so let's make a few changes here. For example, let's take this position marker right up here between this yellow and the brown, and let's change its location. So let's take it and let's drag it until you see the position here gets to about 0.7, something like that. Between 0.7 and 0.75 is going to work out just fine. So let's go ahead and do another render region. And you can see this, we get more of a flamey look. It's starting to get a little bit brighter. You can see the core of the fire is starting to show up a little bit more, which is what we want. We want this to look real hot, real strong, real violent. I mean, it is a flamethrower after all. Okay, so let's go to over here to the first color swatch, And this color swatch looks pretty good. The value is already by default at 2 because I used a fire preset down here. So this one looks pretty good. I don't think I'll have to adjust this one. Um, this little marker up here though, I'm not going to move it. I'm going to leave it like that. Looks perfectly fine. Okay. If you accidentally create a color here by clicking on a gradient, which can happen a lot, just right click on a marker and hit delete marker and everything goes back to normal. Okay, so here's how my color gradient looks like. I have black at the end, then I have this brown. This marker was moved closer toward the brown to bring out more of this yellow hot color. And these two color swatches, this bright white and this orange yellow, were blown out using the value here, which was driven past 1, which makes it real bright and makes it look real hot. So let's go over here to the gradient position and adjust some parameters here. Okay, so our cloud density, I'm going to leave at the default, which looks just fine. And the age percentage parameter here, I'm also going to leave at the default, which looks just fine. Down here we have these other inputs. If you notice, we have an input 3, input 4, 5, 6, and that's all we have right there, 6 inputs. So what can we use these inputs for? Well, we can add a little bit more detail to the particle effect using those inputs. If I go ahead and do a render region now, I can see my fire effect here is pretty detailed, but I can add some more detail to it using those extra inputs. Okay, so that's what I'm going to actually do. Let me hide the render region there. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to enable input number 3. Okay, let's close that. Now we need to plug something into input number 3. What can we plug in? Well, we have these new shaders, these new nodes in exercise 7. Let's go to the preset manager. And if we go to the texture category, we have the cell scaler and we have the fractal scaler, which we talked about in previous videos earlier in this tutorial. Okay, so now it's time to put them to use in an actual production scenario and see how they work. So let's take the fractal scaler and drop it in here, and we'll also take a cell scaler just for the sake of using it in production so you can see how these tie in together and add to the overall effect of the particles. Now we have to plug them into this particle gradient right here. So where do we plug them into? Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the fractal scaler, I'm going to drag its output on top of the particle gradient, and when XSI asks me where I want to plug it into, I want to go under the per particle input 3 and plug it into that input. So now it's plugged in there. And if I open up the particle gradient, you'll see right here I have this little key icon in red. That means that the fractal scalar node is plugged into this input right here, which is exactly what I want. Okay, so now let's go ahead and let's open up the fractal scalar node PPG here and see how we can go ahead and start to adjust this. So if I bring up my render region again and I do a new render, you'll notice that as it renders, the effect of the fire has changed. It's a pretty subtle change, but if you look closely, you'll notice that the effect has changed. So we can use this fractal to adjust the fire shader here a little bit further, and that's what we're going to do. Okay. A neat way of working with this fractal scalar shader is to come down here to the actual fractal scalar shader here in the render tree. Click on the V icon to open up a little render preview here. So this is what our fractal looks like. Let's go ahead and adjust some of these parameters to change the way that it looks. So let's take the color 1 for example. Let's increase this, and as we increase this we can see it update in the little render preview. So let's get it to about 0.3. And let's take the color 2 and drop that to about 0.7. If you get close to 0.7, it's pretty good. So now we get less contrast here. It has more of these gray tones to it. We can also switch the colors by checking this check marks, and you can see the checkbox changes the colors around. So let's switch them. And down here I'm going to leave these contrast parameters alone. Let's go to noise. And now I can adjust some of these noise parameters. I'll leave the noise tab to fractal sum instead of turbulence, because if I switch to turbulence, I don't like the contrast effect there for my particles. So I'll go back to fractal sum, and you can see it updating down here in the shader ball preview, which is pretty cool. Okay, let's take the recursion level and let's increase it. As we increase it, we can see that the effect becomes more and more detailed. So This was a setting of 1. It looks very blurry, doesn't look very detailed. If we go up to 6, now it looks more detailed, and the details are finer, which is what I want. Let's increase the scale down parameter, and you can see as we do that, the details become more apparent and they come out more. So let's increase this to say 3.5, and we get this finer detail here. So you can see the little noise and everything looks pretty good. Let's take the gain and smooth and let's knock it down so this becomes even more detailed. So let's knock it down to something like 0.8 or close to 0.8, so we can see we had this fine detail. That's going to add a nice little noisy effect to our fire shader. It's going to be a subtle effect, but it's going to be pretty nice. As far as these parameters down here go, they look pretty good so far in the default, so I'll leave them alone. I'll go over here to texture support now. Okay, and what I want to do is I have these pre-scale parameters. I can choose small noise, which makes it very noisy. The effect, it's got a lot of tiny graininess in it. Then of course we have the default from before, and then we have big noise, which gives us this interesting color pattern here, which is going to really change the way that our particles look. Let's drop this to about 4, so it's a little bit under half of what it originally was. Okay, so now we have this contrasty effect, which looks really cool. I'll leave the scale per axis alone. We can actually scale this in different axes here to make the effect look different. But I'm going to go ahead and leave it uniform at 2, 2, and 2, which is the default. Okay, so I'm happy with this. Let's close that. Let's close that, and let's bring out our render preview again. So there's our first render. Now let's see how the effect changes the fire. So now you can see we have this kind of graininess in here. It's very subtle. It doesn't make a huge drastic change to our particles, which is great because you don't want it to destroy what you've already created. But it adds this nice little subtle detail, so now we have this extra noise in our fire effect, which looks pretty cool. And it's a good idea to use reference images of real flamethrowers and fires like this when you're working on something like this to go ahead and give you a nice rough guide as to how this should look. Okay. So this video is run for a pretty long time, so tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to stop it here, and in the next video we'll just continue exactly where I left off. I'm not going to change anything until we get back in the next video. That way you get to see the whole process and you don't miss anything. So I'll stop this video here, and we'll pick up in the next one.